Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq Market Site, we have Gaurav Kandhari, founder and president of ValueDo Life Sciences Consulting, Ben Zeev, CEO of World Housing Solution, and Ryan David Williams, founding partner of Ashbury Legal. We're here to discuss how legislative priorities, regulatory frameworks, and commercial strategies are driving U.S. competition. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. I'm excited to have this conversation because the three of you are from three very distinct industries, all thinking about U.S. leading from an innovation perspective. So, Gaurav, I'm going to kick it off with you. Briefly give us some background on ValueDo.
Yeah, so ValueDo has been a life sciences advisory organization for the past 12 years. A couple of years ago, we realized, that US is the innovation hub, for pharma across the world. So we got into AI applications. We did tools, but then we now have like a big platform that is a SaaS platform that is AI and NLP empowered. And it helps pharma companies, especially in commercial, to engage with the HCPs, right? So HCPs means healthcare professionals. Pharma has been, engaging with them for like 100 plus years. That's the front line. But I think with the advent of AI, things have been changing. So to digitize, to have agentic AI, approaches to engage with the doctors, because doctors do not have access. They don't want to meet the reps and MSL. So I guess a little bit of that is the background in terms of ValueDo, what ValueDo does, and now is going into.
And Ron, World Housing Solution, you're more on the infrastructure and logistics.
Yes, so we launched about 16 years ago in response to emergency requirements around the world, primarily Haiti at the beginning, and since then pivoted into the Department of Defense, where we've been very fortunate to be able to work with our troops and deploy infrastructure solutions around the world for the DoD, but also working with the UN peacekeeping forces, as well as deploying medical assets for FEMA and other requirements. And the key for us is being able to then take those lessons learned from the Department of Defense and what we've been able to do for our troops and others as well within the country, and then taking those lessons learned into how do we now impact housing and the both the affordability, but also the solution, the fact that there's close to 4.7 million homes required in the US, and you can't fix that using the old strategy. So we're now launching into the modular housing solutions.
Yeah, and Ryan, you are in the digital asset space.
Yeah, that's right. So I started Ashbury Legal about 10 years ago. We're a boutique law firm based in San Francisco, and we kind of focus on what we call frontier tech. And so these are areas where technology has kind of outpaced legal precedent, right? Which is a difficult and interesting place to be in as a lawyer. You're taught to rely on legal precedent, and all of a sudden you're representing innovators where there is by definition no precedent, and how do you advise them? And so that's been historically digital assets for us. For the last 10 years, we've been working in the space. But now we're starting to see the convergence of digital assets with artificial intelligence, with robotics, and all sorts of kind of future-looking innovations. And I think a lot of the lessons we've learned and how to advise entrepreneurs when there's no legal precedent can now be kind of applied. Those methodologies and philosophy can be applied to kind of new areas of innovation as well.
Yeah, which is so interesting, Gaurav, because you were talking about how AI is just accelerating technology versus what doctors can keep up. There's an example, doctors and attorneys are trained in very specific methodologies, right? So, all your clinical and your academic training, it's almost turned on its head because the technology is just, not that it's displacing, it's enhancing their professions, but you still have to learn and understand it and model out your risk as an example as a medical professional.
So you're spot on. That is the key and the anchor. AI has been around, in pharma as well. So AI has been accepted by pharma R&D quite a bit. 350 to 410 billion dollars by 2025 is the economic impact of AI just on pharma. So of that, 90 to 110 billion is Gen AI impact. Most of it has been, positively impacting the pharma R&D to do trials and all. Now, but that said, why commercial pharma is not adopting as much AI or not scaling, I must say, is because of the lack of compliance. Right. Hallucinations, compliance, FDA requirements, we are hiding behind all of those and saying, this cannot be compliant or we may not be able to scale it. But I think that's where we need to go next in the next 10 years. commercial will adopt, AI in a compliant way. I think that's the platform that we were talking about earlier. It does it in a very compliant manner. Medical, legal, regulatory, to Ryan's point, is a must-have. You cannot just have a OpenAI wrapper and say, that's going to change things within
and that's one of the challenges that you see in the capital markets as well. Healthcare and capital markets, two of the most heavily regulated industries, and we don't have blanket regulation. We regulate by sectors in the U.S. for the most part. So that has been part of the challenge when it comes to digital assets and traditional finance companies adopting digital asset strategies for essentially the same reasons, not understanding that framework, although we understand it a little bit better now.
Yeah, we're getting there slowly, right? And there might be some more legislation coming down the pipeline with the Clarity Act or kind of the Market Structure Act, right? But I would say it's even more specific in digital assets than in industry by industry. It's asset by asset, right? We've created this regulatory regime where you start with, well, how do I classify this thing? What is this thing? And then I can tell you what the rules are, right? But when you start to have this new technology, this new asset class that can shift and it can morph, and regulators are even, have suggested that it can be in one context a commodity, in another context it can be a security. All of a sudden, this classification-based regulatory regime is really impossible to navigate. Like, well, when do I report to the CFTC? When do I need to talk to the SEC if this thing's constantly in flux? And so I think this kind of premise of we identify classifications and then create rules based on that classification needs to be kind of rethought in this world where these assets really serve multiple purposes to different constituents at the same time in different jurisdictions around the world.
Yeah, that's a great, those are all excellent points. We can get into privacy classifications as well, but a conversation for another topic. In terms of infrastructure and logistics, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing with technology that's just rapidly deploying before perhaps the physical side of the equation can catch up?
So you start first with, again, going back to regulatory requirements, there's now a big push by the federal government for contractors and subcontractors to implement what is called a CMMC protection, and that overlaps on AI and what you can and can't share. And we've all seen recently that Grok just, there was a big data breach and a lot of information. So we have to be very careful on how we utilize this in order to be able to implement our solutions and respond rapidly. And those are always challenges because it's both tangible and intangible on how do you push this out into the market, but those are challenges that we all have to navigate. But right now it's still the Wild West, right? There's still a lot of unknowns.
Well, I mean, from the American-built solution perspective, you want to figure out what these frameworks look like. You want the investment. You want to understand what the policy looks like, and that's the only way that we're going to maintain and grow global leadership.
Without a doubt, and our challenge today is there's a big push to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., right? That's a drumbeat that has been across the aisle, and it's a challenge for us to be able to implement that, going back to robotics and automation. How do you implement all those things where many of those items are not made in the U.S. and are implemented in a complicated way, and there's now a lot of barriers to be able to bring those back into the U.S. So we're all challenging, we're all challenged by those headwinds on how do you solve this, but we have to do that in order to be able to affect and implement solutions that are great for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, the skill sets as well is something that we have to think about, and making sure that the workforce is reskilled, educated, and they're being educated for the right roles.
You seem to be reading my mind, Jill. I guess that is one of the biggest challenges as well as an opportunity. At least I can speak for pharma, and that's what I know. But I guess the upskilling of people who are going to use these technologies is a must-have. Otherwise there is this fear, there is resistance, cultural resistance, and then there's this lack of training that is available. If you combine all those, the challenge becomes an opportunity, because then you are doing performance coaching, then you're doing micro-learning on these different technologies for the people who need to drive it beyond the technologists. They can drive it home in a way that, the different use cases that we are talking about.
Well, this is why I think, in particular, when it comes to logistics and infrastructure, that public-private partnerships and academia plays a critical role. You need the nimbleness of the private markets and the investment of private markets. You need the scalability and support of the public markets, and then academia is the incubator for all of these technologies.
100%. But yet we're still, it seems, being in the trenches, that very often we are reactionary, not anticipatory when it comes to the requirements. And those are things that we're dealing with on a every time there's a tragedy across the U.S. or somewhere else in the world, but there's tragedies in the U.S. that we know are coming, right? There will be a hurricane, there will be fires, there will be tornadoes. All those things can be anticipated and managed ahead of time in order to be able to deliver a response. And that's where technology, AI, and those kinds of things can help us and guide the decision-making process and be able to respond in a much faster way so that we don't face the tragedy that we had 20 plus years ago with Katrina or 30 years ago with Katrina.
And this is something that we're seeing with digital asset legislation, how that framework is being developed, especially when you're talking about agentic AI and autonomous compliance and so forth, where you're starting to take a more proactive privacy, cybersecurity compliant approach. And not only just because it's more affordable and you're operating over so many global jurisdictions, but it's going to become the competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we focus a lot on like federal regulation, right? And so, but I think you touched on AI, and I think it's a good example of, there's recent legislation that died in the Senate, unfortunately, but to preempt state law with respect to AI regulation for the next 10 years. And I think it's really important because from where I sit, we're not responsive. We have to advise these clients how to do things, before we have any answers from regulators or legislatures. And so when they come to us and say, well, hey, Ryan, I want to build feature X, Y, or Z into my product, we have to, we have two options. There's two worlds. There's a world in which there's a myriad of state laws that have been hyperly specific, adapted to or passed for that particular technology. And we have to say, hey, we have to do a 50-state survey. We have to look at every single law out there in every single country and apply it to your specific fact pattern, which is a really difficult thing to do for new entrants into this market, right? These are the non-incumbents who don't have large compliance apparatus and legal teams. There's another world in which, rather than implementing new laws for everything, every new technology, we actually take a long, hard look at, well, can existing legal regimes and frameworks and common law principles, a lot of the things we're concerned about with AI can be addressed by things like fraud and market manipulation. There are already rules for these things. And I think the longer we can exercise a little bit of restraint to see how those play out a little bit first, and that way I can provide general advice about general principles of law and let my startup still move quickly, because literally the only advantage they have against the incumbents is speed to execution. Mm-hmm. And the moment I say, well, let me look at what 50 very specific state legislatures have done for your very specific new product, that advantage is out the window, the incumbents are further entrenched, and I think innovation suffers.
I mean, we had an EEOC commissioner on with us last year, and he was like, Jill, regardless of a human or an artificial intelligence mechanism making the decision in terms of who gets hired or fired, there's still a framework within.
Absolutely.
You have to operate. And again, going back to healthcare as an example, HIPAA is, it is probably one of the most heavily regulated sectoral laws on the books that there are. So even when you're thinking about AI innovation within the healthcare space, now you're thinking about privacy as well. There's just so many layers is where the complexity lies.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think piggybacking on what you both are saying, I guess regulatory, there are two aspects, right? One is we see the devil when it's not there. Yeah. We talk about HIPAA as if, it's going to, we cannot just overcome that. It's very straightforward, simple rules that we have to make sure that there is no privacy breach. Mm-hmm. We got a HIPAA compliance for our platform within like 3 months. We got a SOC 2 compliance in 6 months. So there are controls that if you follow, you are able to kind of accomplish things. We went to a pharma, they said the guideline organization, state guideline, the federal guideline organizations would not allow this. Said, let's give it a shot. So we went to the guideline organization. Within 20 days, they approved all the content we wanted to kind of have behind our AI platform. So I think the 2 points I'm trying to make is, one is, it's good if you know how to kind of go about compliance and regulatory expectations, but two, they are evolving as well, right? And there are people behind the desk in those organizations who are open to new ideas. But if you do not kind of go to them and say, this is how these guidelines need to evolve, or these laws need to kind of be implemented, it's procrastination then, then you will not be able to evolve.
And I think HIPAA is a perfect example of what I was talking about, right? Because there's a lot of concerns, legitimate concerns about privacy with respect to AI, right? But I would say before, and so do we need, Colorado passed the Colorado AI Act, right? Dealt with a lot of these privacy issues. I would say before you run to do that, does HIPAA already, satisfy and mitigate those risks in the kind of medical sector, right? Do things like GDPR in the UK and the CCPA in California, do these already address some of those concerns, at least for the short term, while we let this nascent industry really grow and thrive? Can we rely on some of those existing frameworks rather than rushing to kind of create a myriad and a labyrinth of state
California's
regulation.
laws are essentially modeled off of GDPR.
Off GDPR, yeah.
They're modeled off of. Well, and Ron, this is where experience comes into it, boots on the ground, as you were saying before, because sometimes, smaller companies or from the entrepreneurial mindset, you're thinking about the product itself. And sometimes you have to understand these frameworks that go into it in order to be able to execute on your ideas. And that goes back to PPPs and working with academia in order to bring these to fruition.
And so, at World Housing Solution, what we have done now is really try to look at the overall landscape and understand where both pitfalls and opportunities exist, and how can we take lessons learned from what we've done in the past to address, in our case, primarily the housing market now in the United States, and focus very heavily on the modular side, because that's what we've been doing for almost 16, 17 years. So trying to implement all of that and pulling that together, going back to both of what you said, and riding two horses. Right now we're looking at the commercial and residential market, but commercial side as far as sales as opposed to governmental, and we have to now create two different ecosystems, because the government has so many regulations that are imposed upon you. But then on the commercial side, on trying to deal with the consumer aspect, we are looking at all the various regulations on the ground, right? So county to county, city to city, things change, and you're trying to create a one-size-fits-all, and in the United States in particular, it's extremely complicated, as opposed to the European system where, France has a building code for France. We have a building code that we're in Florida. We have a building code that changes, again, city to city, county to county, and so we have to look at all those things together in order to be able to actually deliver a product that makes sense to the consumer.
Yeah, I also think understanding, Ryan, who your audience is, and I think the digital asset space did a good job in terms of advocating for the industry and understanding who the audience is. There's one way to talk to the board, the C-suite, your consumers, policymakers, educators, and I think that's critical in terms of making these initiatives happen.
Yeah, and I think, and also finding ways to kind of cut through party lines, right, and traditional kind of how we think about what conservative or liberal viewpoints are, right? So for example, I tend to believe that deregulating some of the private equity markets here in the US and making those more democratically accessible to the retail public is actually, and that's typically kind of considered a conservative talking point, to deregulate securities markets. I think it's actually like the key way to decrease the wealth disparity and inequality in this country, right? Which is kind of a more liberal talking point, right? Typically you'd expect. So when you have this issue like this, and you can really appeal to both sides and say, this is not really a political issue. This is an issue about American innovation that might be a Republican strategy to affect what is a liberal or Democratic kind of priority. Now all of a sudden you get people in the room together and things can actually happen.
We saw it with
the Stablecoin Act. Well, hopefully we see that with the Clarity Act. I think the digital assets has really, the industry overall and how politics have gone about it, really sets a model, I think, for other areas of innovation to figure out how to speak to both sides of the aisle and get something done on the Hill.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And Gaurav, we'll give you the last word here as it relates to healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've covered it well, but I guess just to wrap it up, from a healthcare perspective, it's all about they embracing it, AI, NLP, Gen AI, robotics. They embracing it, but not embracing it to use it. It's embracing it to build it, right? I guess a couple of big platforms that are made across industries, we are still wrapping things around that. Really being able to build them and then being able to scale them is sort of the name of the game for pharma. They have managed to do it in healthcare, R&D, pharma, but I guess it needs to be, replicated in other functional areas as well. From a policy perspective, it needs to be evolved, to make sure that those policies are not driven by the policymakers only. It's, updated in collaboration with the industry, with the people who are kind of driving the healthcare industry as well.
It just makes economic sense at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
You reskill all the workers, train them for the right roles. Those are well-paid salary jobs that advance innovation forward for the U.S. and then it clearly goes back into the economy. Appreciate everyone's insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks and thanks for joining me at MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.